Hi, my name's Scott, the Miniature Maniac, and today we're continuing the Heavy Metal series with the blackest legion out there, the Black Legion. They're called the Black Legion, literally. It is impossible to paint a Space Marine like Heavy Metal and produce a video on it in a single week. What can I say? I like to under-promise and over-deliver, and also flat-out lie. What up, Mini family? Welcome back to the series that is loved by you and hated by me, but at least this time the blow is softened a little bit because we're painting a bad boy and not a pretty boy. If you're not familiar with the series, what Heavy Metal Marines is I'm trying to replicate what you see on Games Workshop's box arts 1-for-1. And this paint scheme, if you can even call it that, is not meant for your armies. And if you try to paint an entire army like this, you will literally die. I'm just some internet goon stumbling through the process trying to unravel the mysteries of heavy metal. Spoilers, there's lots of edge highlighting. Speaking of edge highlighting, I've linked a video playlist in the top right-hand corner of prerequisites. I vomited a little because that word reminds me of college. If I ever use a word like base coating, or edge highlighting, or glazing, the odds are that there is a video dedicated entirely to that technique that distills the ins and outs of the process, so I don't have to rehash it every single time I paint a miniature. So if you're like, I don't know how to do that, likely there's a video linked in the top right-hand corner that will explain the ins and outs of that technique. I don't like to repeat information about technique a lot, so this gives us more time to talk about the mini that we're painting in the video specifically, and also more time for memes, of which there are many. This time we're doing something a little bit different. Normally I buy all new Citadel paint if I don't own any to replace other third-party brands, so I'm using only GW paint, but this time I'm going to use whatever I own to show you that you can get close to their box art without actually using their product. You can leave your disgust in the comment section below for tainting GW minis with non-GW paint. Let's get ready to rumble! The miniature comes from the box set Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress. I do actually plan to play this game, but the minis inside the box are so fantastic that I bought it purely out of love for those sculpts. If you want to pick up a copy of Blackstone Fortress, you can find a link in the description below. This guide comes in a few pieces and requires some cleanup. Most of it can be taken care of with an X-Acto knife, but I like to use a sponge sanding twig to do curved surfaces. Unlike the flat blade of the X-Acto, the sponge will conform to the surface. All the tools I use in the course of this video process will also be linked below. I adhered some of the pieces together with Tamiya thin plastic cement. I kept the gun, head, and backpack separate to make painting all those parts that no one's ever gonna see a lot easier. There was a minor gap in his belt, so I took a second bottle of Tamiya thin cement that was running a little bit low and put some plastic sprue bits into it until it melted into a fluid plastic goo substance, and then put this goo in the crack to hide the gaps. You can thank model kit makers for that little trick, about 1,000,000 times better than liquid green stuff. I then primed the miniature in Vallejo Surface Primer Black and then applied my first base coat via airbrush of Abaddon Black. Some of you may wonder why I applied Abaddon over my already black base coat. Undoubtedly, during the impending edge highlighting process, I will make mistakes and have to correct those mistakes with black paint. I don't have the same black shade as the Vallejo primer, and I'd rather not my corrections look like patchwork. If I paint with black paint, it might use a different finish or be a different shade than the original primer. So I'll just base coat it in a black color, and I'll use that black color for my corrections later on, so it'll be nice and seamless. Now with that done, it's time to move on to edge highlighting. According to the booklet included in the box game, it says the first color is Incubi Darkness, which I don't have, so I'll start with something close to it and see if it works. My first attempt was with an old Citadel foundation paint called Fenris Gray. This color was a little bit too bright, so I tried to mix it with Abaddon Black in a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay, now that we've got a closer color, it's time to actually edge highlight this miniature. Except for one thing. There aren't a lot of edges on this Marine's black power armor. Don't get me wrong, there are some, but a lot of them are obscured by the metallic trim. So what does the Heavy Metal team decide to do? Well, they can't not edge highlight power armor. So they run a very thin line next to the trim with a little black line separating it from the trim and the power armor. Whose idea was this? Darren, was that you? Max? Perhaps at this point we're not even edge highlighting, we're just freehand tracing the trim.
Why do I do this to myself?
As ridiculous as it is, it seems the original artist didn't go gung-ho on every single part of the black armor. You can see on the Marine's right shin that the highlight isn't that bright. This might be because the artist wanted to save time or because they were spiraling into madness. One little problem I was having while edge highlighting was that my paint was drying a bit too fast in my brush. This might have been because I was thinning it too much with water. I added some glaze medium to the highlight color, and this extended its drying time, making the process easier. After this first edge highlight, I followed it up with a thinner edge highlight with Bearing Blue. When that was complete, I did one last edge highlight of Arctic Blue, targeting the corners where two lines meet. Before moving on, I'd like to address something about the color black. I get endless questions about how to paint black stuff, mostly black power armor. Some of you may watch this process and be like, I don't have those paints! That's okay, just use one similar that you have. Like with all heavy metal stuff, the process is generally the same, just the colors change. And even if you don't have the color, black can be highlighted with anything. As long as enough black sticks around in the midtone to read as black, then you should be good to go. In your next black armor, try using purple or green as an edge highlight. Okay, tangent over. With the black armor complete, it's time to move on to the next feature that's predominant on the model, and that's the metallic trim. The gold/brass color used is a fairly anemic looking metallic color, so I started with Liberator Gold. I know what you're thinking, Liberator Gold on top of black primer, that must have taken a long time to get coverage. Well, it did. It took a long time, and I'm trying to think about what mistakes I made in my life to get to this point. Fortunately, I passed the time by listening to an audiobook on Audible by Aaron Dembski Bowden called The Talent of Horus. Audible is offering the Mini family a 30-day trial to Audible and a free audiobook when signing up at audibletrial.com/Miniac, which is also linked in the description below. The Talent of Horus is part of a book series about the Black Legion. And ever since I read Aaron Dembski Bowden's trilogy on the Night Lords, I've been hooked on his vision of what Chaos Space Marine are. In the trilogy on Night Lords, they are not well off and they are poor and they're grasping at straws. And in this audiobook, they are nostalgic about their time on Prospero and painfully self-aware of their inability to unite as one. It's amazing how much character Aaron can jam-pack into a superhuman killing machine. It just makes the read so much better. If you want to listen to this audiobook, you can get a new trial at audibletrial.com/Miniac and pick up your free audiobook today. Thanks, Audible. All right, back to the paint job. After the Liberator Gold base coat was completely opaque about 3,000 layers later, it was time to do some shading. Around each bolt in the armor there is a very dark and very matte shadow. It's almost like grime building up on the armor, which suits the character of this bad boy. You can tell it's matte because when you rotate the picture on the site, the highlight is obvious on the metallic trim, but it's non-existent on the shadowed area. I'm not entirely sure how Heavy Metal did this. They could have glazed a combination of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade into the areas around the bolts. The GW shades tend to dry quite matte. I used a 1-to-1 mixture of flat black and brown leather from scale 75, which is a very matte paint range, and I glazed it over many layers to get the right amount of intensity in the shadows. I went a little crazy with the glaze in some spots, so I came back with Liberator Gold to tone it down. Finally, I busted out my brightest silver, speed metal, and edge highlighted the trim. And I edge highlighted, and edge highlighted, and edge highlighted, and edge highlighted.
Goodbye, cruel world.
Next, I'm moving on to the dark metal parts, which are spread out across the marine like the vents on his backpack, his grenade, so on and so forth. I started with a base coat of bolt gun metal. I also added some scratches with this color to the gun casing itself, which is fairly distressed in the box art. It's worth mentioning that I'm doing a lot of my metallics in one step, so I can clean out my water and then continue with the rest of the miniature. If I were to not clean out my water, I'd get a bunch of metallic flakes in my normal paint, and then instead of this guy being a Chaos Space Marine, he'd be a Chaos Sparkle Marine. After that, I washed the bolt gun down with Nuln Oil to darken it down even more. It seems like the box art is a very dark silver, followed by an incredibly bright edge highlight, so next I busted out speed metal again, and edge highlighted all those dark metal parts. After that, I worked on the warmer gold parts, such as the eye on his shoulder and some decorative elements on his gun. I started with a base coat of Retributor Gold, which is much warmer than Liberator Gold, and then washed it with Reikland Flesh Shade to make it even warmer. I then began applying layers of Liberator Gold. Metallic paint seems to have fairly poor transparency, which is helpful in this case. I can highlight the warm gold parts in a fairly aggressive way without removing all the warmth because the metallic paint is so transparent and the underlayers show through. At the very end, I edge highlighted some of the sharp points with speed metal. The last metallic part was the magazine of the weapon. What look like bullet casings are very coppery in tone, so I painted them first with dwarf bronze, which didn't seem red enough when compared to the box art, so I washed them twice in Citadel's Reikland Flesh Shade to really make them warm. I followed this up with a highlight of dwarf bronze and speed metal mixed in a 1-to-1 ratio. Since it's such a small part, it doesn't need so many layers of highlights. Now on to the red fabric parts. I started with a base coat of Mephiston Red, and the inspector had a look. He said it was a little bit too bright red, so I washed it twice with Nuln Oil, being careful to get the wash to settle into the crevices evenly. After that was dry, I applied a second layer of Mephiston Red to bring out the detail. Generally, I'm applying the highlights to the parts of the fabric closer to the waist and then feathering it down. If you want to see a fully uncut example of how I blend colors like in this situation, check out the How I Blend video, which is linked in the top right-hand corner. After I'd gotten the right amount of opacity on this stage, I did the same thing with Wild Rider Red, but more sparingly, making sure to not cover up my previous layer entirely. Finally, I did an edge highlight with Citadel's Fire Dragon Bright. It's worth mentioning that the symbol on his right shoulder pad gets the same treatment, except at the end I do some tiny white dots on select corners of the cracked insignia. Next, we'll work on the other scrap of cloth attached to his right arm. I don't know why this guy has cloth on both arms. He's starting to remind me of like a 70s greaser, and I'm expecting to find a pack of cigs tucked away in one of these sleeves. This fabric is painted in a very desaturated blue-green color, so I took some ardent green and deep blue and mixed that with flat black in a 2:1 ratio to get my first base color. I then proceeded to add more and more Arctic blue to the mixture, adding thinner and thinner edge highlights. I also made sure to add scrapes and slashes to make the cloth look worn and beaten up. I like how despite there being several dark elements on this marine, his power armor, some cloth, and his interjoint tubes, the original box artist decided to break them up by highlighting them differently. Remember what I said earlier about how you can highlight black different colors? Well, here's an example of that. Next, we'll work on the bone elements. First, we'll start by base coating them all brown gray, and then we'll turn our attention to the knee pad. To bring out some of the details of the knee pad, I'll wash it with Army Painter Strong Tone. This is nothing more than helping me see where all the details are. I'll then clean it up with a second layer of brown gray, making sure to keep the dark parts in the recesses. Next, adding progressively more and more Mojave white to the brown gray, I highlight the knee pad until I'm highlighting with pure Mojave white. At this stage is when I also go and highlight all the smaller teeth that are growing out in bizarre areas. I wonder what shoulder pads eat. Because these details are so small, we don't need to apply multiple layers. 2 layers is fine. Next, we're on to the brown leather parts, such as the belt and holster around his waist. We'll start by base coating in Rhinox hide. After that, we'll follow it up with an edge highlight of Bastille brown, followed by an edge highlight of Bastille brown and Mojave white mixed together in a 1:1 ratio. Next, on to the grizzly flesh straps that he has tied around his gun for fun. I started with a base coat of Kislev flesh and then proceeded to glaze in Reichland flesh shade, following the box art for where I put the color. If you're curious about the technique of glazing, you can check out my video on the subject in the top right-hand corner of the screen. Something I want to address in this specific instance is that we're using a Citadel shade to apply a glaze. Glazing and shading are techniques, not necessarily products. You can take a Citadel shade and glaze with it, just like with an ink or a normal acrylic paint, so long as you followed the basic principle of glazing. Once I had built up enough intensity in the shadows, I got out pale flesh and started to apply highlights. I put down thick opaque color and feathered it out with a clean damp brush to get my blend. This blending method doesn't really work on larger areas, but it works sufficiently on something small like this. Next, we're painting the tube things in Steven's leg joints and his chest straps. What? I named him Steven. We've been spending so much time together, edge hiding for an eternity, that it just felt appropriate. I hate you, Steven! We started on the black parts with an edge highlight of Eshin Gray, followed up with a second and final edge highlight of Codex Gray. Next, I'll paint the grenade on his hip by first base coating in Caliban Green, followed by a wash of Nuln Oil, finished with an edge highlight of Death World Forest. At this point, I was getting excited to have the mini done, so I attached the backpack and the gun with some super glue, and then it was on to the last and certainly not least detail, the face. One thing I liked about the box art for this figure was the sides of his heads were a pinker flesh. Inspired by this, I started with a base coat of pink flesh. How convenient. Next, I applied a wash of Reichland flesh shade so that all the little details on his forehead would pop out a little bit more. I then began to apply a second layer of pink flesh to clean up the step where I applied the shade last. I then highlighted with a 1:1 mixture of pale flesh and pink flesh. And then finally did one last highlight of pale flesh, keeping in mind that the acrylic paint can and is mostly applied translucently. So the more layers of pale flesh you apply, the more opaque it becomes, so take advantage of that when you're trying to blend from one color to the next. Next, I dotted the eyes with an off-white color and picked out the pupils with black. I made that sound easier than it was. The eyes being so close to the little mask thing on his face made it very difficult to do, and I had to redo it at least 3 times. With the eyes done, it was time to pop the head on. Things are getting real now. Now, foolishly, I attached Steven to the base, so I can't very easily replicate the basing style that EAVY Metal does for the boxed set. So let's just phone it in with some dirt and some dry brushing. I know it's lazy, but I'm kind of getting sick of Steven. Steven, you suck. And with that half-assed base complete, EAVY Metal Black Legion is finally complete. Now let's see how close to the box art I got. The edge highlighting on the black armor in the box art is definitely lower profile. I still need to manage to get thinner lines. Damn you, EAVY Metal! Or should I say, EAVY Highlight Metal. In regards to the black armor, I also think there was a little bit more of a satin look on theirs when compared to mine, despite me using Abaddon Black. It also seems I went a little bit too hardcore with the weathering on the gun. I forgot the old adage, less is more. I didn't mess up on the entire thing, however. I think the metallic trim is pretty dang close, as is the red cloth. This is the 7th EAVY Metal Marine video I've done on my channel. It's the longest running series on my channel, and I was feeling a little bit nostalgic, so I figured let's look at the first Marine we ever painted. Holy buckets! Does that model look terrible? Well, that's it for this one, guys. If you like this video, there are 6 others that you can watch. Maybe skip the first one. That you can find linked in the top right-hand corner of this video. Well, guys, as a recap, if you want to listen to that book that I listened to on Audible, Talent of Horus, you can get your free trial and free book at audibletrial.com/Miniac. Subscribe or die! And most importantly, don't forget to burn more minis!